The morning moved slowly as if the forest itself were uncertain about waking. Mist still clung to the low grass, thinning only where pale sunlight pressed through broken branches. He stood at the edge of the clearing without stepping into it, aware of every sound his boots might make against leaf and stone. From that distance, the shapes near the fallen log were easy to mistake for shadows or discarded bark. Only after several minutes of stillness did their outlines begin to separate into something fragile and living. Two small bodies lay close together, pressed flank to flank. Their striped coats were dull with dust, their limbs drawn inward as if conserving what little warmth they had left. Neither cub lifted its head. Neither shifted its weight. Their sides rose and fell so faintly that it required steady focus to see the movement at all. In healthy cubs, there was usually restlessness, twitching tails, small bursts of clumsy play. Here, there was only stillness and the shallow rhythm of breathing. He adjusted his stance slightly, easing pressure off one foot without lifting it. Every movement was measured. The forest carried sound easily, and he did not want to be the reason their mother stayed away if she was nearby. His binoculars rose slowly to his eyes. Through the lenses, he saw dried mud clinging to their whiskers, tiny burrs caught in their fur. One cub's ear twitched once, then settled again. The other made a weak, breathy sound, more air than voice. Around them, the clearing remained quiet. No heavy footsteps in the brush. No warning calls from birds. No sudden breaking of branches. Time stretched in thin, careful layers. He watched for signs of return. Flattened grass, distant movement, the soft rustle that often came before a tigress emerged. Nothing appeared. Only wind passed through the tall grass, bending it gently, then releasing it. Minutes turned into longer spans he did not measure. He studied the cubs for small changes. One shifted its paw slightly, claws barely visible. The other lifted its head an inch, swayed, and let it fall back against the ground. The effort seemed to drain it. Their ribs showed faintly beneath their coats, not sharply, but enough to suggest days without proper feeding. He lowered the binoculars and murmured, almost without sound, "It's okay, little ones," though he knew they could not hear him. The words were more for restraint than comfort, reminding himself not to rush, not to interfere too soon. In this landscape, intervention carried weight. A wrong step could mean rejection. A wrong scent could mean abandonment. He shifted again, kneeling slowly to bring his body closer to the earth. From there, he could see the slight tremor in one cub's flank as it struggled to maintain warmth. Flies hovered briefly near their noses, then drifted away. Neither cub snapped at them. Their energy was reserved for breathing. Clouds moved across the sun, dimming the clearing for a moment. Light softened, turning the grass silver-green. The cubs lay within it, small and quiet, wrapped in stillness. Somewhere beyond the trees, a distant bird called, and the sound faded into the layered hush of the forest. He remained where he was, watching, waiting, holding space for a mother who had not yet returned, as the wind traced slow patterns through the grass around the unmoving forms. The afternoon thinned slowly into evening, light stretching long across the clearing before slipping away behind the trees. Shadows gathered at the edges first, then crept inward, softening the outlines of grass and fallen branches. The cubs had not changed their position. They remained pressed together, their bodies curled inward, their breathing shallow and uneven. As the temperature dropped, a faint shiver moved through one of them, rippling briefly along its spine before fading. He watched for a long time before moving. The decision did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, shaped by hours of stillness, by the absence of any returning footsteps, by the way the air grew cooler and heavier. When he finally shifted forward, he did so in small, careful increments, pausing between each step. His boots barely disturbed the soil. He kept his body low, his movements slow, aware that any abrupt motion could change everything. Kneeling several feet away, he set down his pack and opened it quietly. Inside were items carried for moments like this, though he never knew when they might be needed. A thin thermal blanket emerged first, folded and light. He did not drape it over the cubs. Instead, he positioned it behind them, angled to block the growing evening wind. It created a small pocket of still air, barely noticeable, yet enough to preserve warmth. Insects had begun to gather as daylight faded. Small flies drifted close to the cubs' faces, landing briefly before lifting again. He waved them away with slow, deliberate motions, never letting his hand come too close. One cub stirred faintly, shifting its head against the other's shoulder. The movement was weak, but it was movement. He paused, watching carefully, then whispered, "Easy now," the words barely louder than breath. From his pack, he removed a shallow container and poured a small amount of clean water into it. He placed it within reach but not directly against them, knowing they might not have the strength to drink yet. For now it was enough that it was there. He adjusted his position so his body formed another barrier against the wind, creating a quiet enclosure without enclosing them. Their fur lifted slightly as warmer air settled around them. One cub's chest rose a little deeper than before. The other released a soft, rasping sound, then grew quiet again. He studied their eyes when they opened briefly, dark and unfocused, drifting past him rather than toward him. There was no recognition, only instinct and exhaustion. He remained still for a long time, hands resting loosely on his knees, breathing slow and even. Occasionally he shifted to brush away another insect or straighten the edge of the blanket. Once he murmured, "I'm here," not as a promise but as a reminder to himself to stay. Beyond the clearing, the forest settled into evening. Leaves rustled gently overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a low call echoed and faded. The sky dimmed to muted gold and gray. In that quiet space between light and dark, he kept watch beside two small, fragile forms, offering warmth and patience, while waiting for any sign that their mother might still find her way back through the deepening shadows. Night did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, darkening first beneath the trees, then slowly spreading across the clearing like a held breath being released. The air cooled further, settling close to the ground. Moisture gathered along the blades of grass, beating quietly at their tips. He remained beside the cubs, shifting only when stiffness demanded it, careful not to disturb the fragile balance he had created around them. At some point, his attention drifted outward beyond their small bodies, back into the surrounding forest. He began to notice details he had not searched for earlier. Along the far edge of the clearing, the soil showed faint depressions, half filled with fallen leaves. They were wide and shallow, softened by time and wind, but unmistakable. Large paws had passed there not long ago. Nearby, a sapling leaned at an odd angle, its bark scraped thin. A cluster of leaves lay crushed beneath it, still slightly damp. He studied these signs quietly, letting them assemble into meaning without forcing it. A healthy tigress moved with confidence, leaving deeper impressions, cleaner breaks. These marks were uneven. Some steps were heavier than others. Some dragged slightly. It suggested effort, imbalance, something carried in pain. From somewhere beyond the trees came a low sound, distant and brief. It was not a call meant to travel far. It was subdued, strained, as if its source lacked the strength to shape it fully. He froze, listening. The forest absorbed the sound almost immediately, folding it into layers of rustle and wind. Still, it lingered in his awareness, quiet but persistent. He glanced back at the cubs. They slept now, pressed tightly together, their breathing slow and shallow. One had tucked its nose beneath the other's chin. Their bodies no longer trembled, protected by warmth and stillness. In their posture he saw not abandonment but waiting, a kind of instinctive holding on. Carefully, he shifted his position to examine more of the ground nearby. There were faint drag marks near the undergrowth, barely visible unless caught at the right angle of light. A broken stem lay flattened in one direction, then another, as though something large had struggled to move through. He did not follow the trail. He only observed it, respecting its boundaries. The realization settled slowly. The mother had been here. She had stayed as long as she could. She had moved when she had no choice. Injury, hunger, exhaustion, or all three together had pulled her away, not indifference. The cubs had been left not because they were unwanted, but because survival had become uncertain. He felt the weight of that understanding without letting it turn into urgency. This was not a moment for rescue in the traditional sense. It was a moment for guardianship without possession. He was not here to replace her. He was here to preserve the space for her return. Softly, almost without sound, he murmured, "Hold on," while adjusting the blanket slightly to block a shifting breeze. The words drifted into the air and disappeared. Far off, another low call moved through the darkness, thinner than before but present. The wind carried it in fragments. He lifted his head and listened, eyes tracing the invisible paths between trees. Around him, grass whispered gently. Insects hummed at a distance. Above, clouds thinned, allowing faint starlight to seep through. Between those distant sounds and the quiet breathing beside him, he understood that this story was still unfolding, shaped not by abandonment but by struggle. And in that fragile space between loss and return, he remained steady, offering protection without ownership, waiting with patience for the forest to decide what would come next. Dawn did not announce itself with brightness. It arrived first as a thinning of darkness, a soft loosening of shadow along the treetops and low branches. The sky shifted from deep blue to muted gray, then slowly to pale gold. Moisture lifted from the ground in faint, drifting threads. In that quiet transition, the forest seemed to hold itself still, listening. He sensed the change before he saw anything. A subtle tightening in the air. A pause in the small movements of insects. Even the leaves seemed to settle. His posture remained calm, but his attention widened, stretching beyond the small circle he had guarded through the night. From the far edge of the clearing, a shape detached itself from shadow. At first, it was only a darker absence among darker trees. Then it became a form. Broad shoulders. A low, deliberate stance. Stripes emerging slowly as light touched them. The tigress stood half hidden by tangled brush, her body angled sideways, her head turned toward the clearing. She did not move forward. She watched. One foreleg rested lightly against the ground, bearing little weight. When she shifted, it did so unevenly. A faint stiffness traveled through her frame. Dried mud and blood marked the fur along her flank. Her breathing was steady but restrained, controlled with effort. Every detail spoke of endurance held together by will. Her gaze moved first to the cubs. They lay as he had left them, pressed together, sheltered, alive. Then her eyes lifted. They found him. He did not move. He kept his hands open on his knees. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing stayed slow. He allowed his presence to be visible without becoming dominant. The space between them remained untouched. For several long moments nothing changed. Wind slid through grass. A bird called once, then fell silent. Light crept higher along the trunks of trees. The tigress lowered her head slightly. It was not submission. It was assessment. She took one careful step forward. Then another. Each movement was measured, deliberate, as though she were testing not the ground, but his intentions. Her tail hung low still. Her ears remained forward, attentive. There was no charge, no threat display, no retreat. Only cautious advance. He whispered once, barely shaping the sound, "You're safe," though he did not know if the words mattered. They were more for the quiet inside himself. She paused again, now fully in the open. Sunlight touched her coat, revealing the depth of its wear, the thinning fur along her ribs, the small tremor in her injured side. Still, her posture held strength. Her presence filled the clearing without effort. When she moved again, it was directly toward her cubs. She passed him at several feet's distance, close enough that he could hear her breath, feel the warmth of her body against the cool air. She did not glance at him. Her attention belonged only to the small forms on the ground. Reaching them, she lowered herself slowly, folding around them like living shelter. One cub stirred at the familiar scent. The other lifted its head weakly, then pressed into her chest. She nudged them gently with her nose, checking, counting, reassuring through touch alone. A soft sound left her throat, low and vibrating. The cubs responded with faint, thin murmurs. He remained still as she gathered them, one paw drawing them closer, her body curving protectively despite its injury. When she finally lifted her head, she glanced once in his direction. Not with challenge. Not with fear. With acknowledgement. Then, as the sun rose higher and warmth spread across the clearing, she began, slowly and carefully, to guide her cubs back toward the sheltering trees, carrying with her both their fragile weight and the quiet trust that had allowed them to survive. Morning continued to unfold gently, light widening across the clearing as the sun lifted higher above the canopy. Warmth returned in thin layers, settling first on the grass, then along the fallen branches, then finally across the striped forms moving slowly toward the trees. The forest, which had held its breath through the night and early dawn, now began to breathe again. The tigress moved with careful precision. Each step was chosen. Each shift of weight was measured against pain and fatigue. One cub walked beside her shoulder, unsteady but determined. The other lagged slightly, its small legs trembling with effort. When it stumbled, she paused without urgency, waiting until it gathered itself and continued. Her body remained angled protectively, forming a moving barrier between her cubs and the open space behind them. Even wounded, her instincts shaped every motion. She guided them along paths softened by leaves and shadow, where roots offered footing and tall grass offered cover. They reached the edge of the clearing slowly. There, where sunlight met shade, she stopped. The cubs pressed against her legs, their sides rising and falling more deeply now, strengthened by warmth and rest. One brushed its head against her chest. The other leaned briefly into her flank. She responded with a gentle nudge, steady and reassuring. Then for a moment she lifted her head. Her gaze traveled back across the clearing. It found him. He was still seated where he had been through the night, his posture relaxed, his presence quiet. Dust clung faintly to his boots. The blanket lay folded beside him. The water container reflected a small flash of morning light. Nothing about him suggested ownership. Nothing suggested pursuit. Only witness. Their eyes met across the widening distance. It was not a stare. It was not a warning. It was recognition. A brief exchange of awareness between two beings who had shared responsibility without intention, who had stood on opposite sides of instinct and choice and found balance for a time. The tigress held his gaze for only a second. Then she turned. With a slow, guiding motion, she led her cubs into the undergrowth. Leaves shifted softly around their bodies. Grass closed behind them. Stripes dissolved into shadow. Within moments, only the faintest movement remained, then nothing at all. The forest reclaimed its own. He did not stand immediately. He remained seated, listening as the sounds of ordinary life returned. Insects resumed their quiet hum. Birds called from deeper branches. Wind traced familiar paths through leaves and tall grass. Somewhere far away, branches creaked under unseen weight. The clearing no longer felt suspended. It was whole again. After some time, he rose slowly, brushing soil from his hands. He packed his blanket, emptied the container, secured his bag. Each movement was unhurried. There was no urgency to leave. No need to linger. He took one last look toward the place where the trees had closed behind them. Nothing stirred. And yet everything remained. He turned and walked back along the narrow trail, carrying with him no proof, no photograph, no record beyond memory. Only the quiet understanding that for a brief stretch of hours, he had been allowed to stand inside the story of a wild family, not as its center, but as its keeper. Behind him, sunlight filtered through leaves, and the forest continued as it always had, sheltering life in layered green and shadow, holding close the soft sounds of movement as mother and cubs disappeared into its endless, living depth.